Guyana, and welcome to another program of the public interest. Now this week we focus on something very serious. There has been an upsurge in violence in Guyana over the past years, but this week it has reached a new level where we saw several persons, including a 4-year-old child, losing his life in one day. That would have been during this past week. On today's program, we discuss why there is an upsurge in violence in our country, and back again is David Granger, Brigadier the Honorable David Granger. He's the leader of the People's National Congress Reform and the leader of the opposition. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Malika.
All right. First off, sir, I'd like to get a reaction from you on what many are calling Bloody Wednesday. I think one of the media houses described it as Bloody Wednesday. We saw a 4-year-old being brutally murdered. You saw 3 alleged criminals being gunned down in Prashad Nagar. Of course, that was high daytime. And then the Rupanoni area, one student stabbing another one to death. And then also at Potential Secondary School, another student was stabbed in his head with a scissors. I mean, a reaction from you, sir, about what would have happened on, and this is just focusing on that one day for now.
Well, it's not just Bloody Wednesday. We're having a bloody period under the People's Progressive Party civic administration. The murder rate in 2012 was even higher than it was during what I call the troubles on the East Coast and elsewhere in 2004. So it seems that under the present administration and under the Minister of Home Affairs, the problem of civil violence is not being solved, is not being reduced, and in fact it's getting worse. Now, what you refer to as Bloody Wednesday, is perhaps a spike or a surge in the incidence of what I call interpersonal violence. And it is something that we have not taken careful measure of over the years, because in some instances we regarded certain types of violence, particularly domestic violence, as being private. If a man hit his wife, it is a private affair. Sometimes even if a man brutalizes his wife and his children, that's a family matter. And maybe 30, 40 years ago it would have never made headline news. But we've seen over the last 20 years in Guyana a new type of violence coming in to the country in the wake of the narcotics trade. And narco traffickers around the world are extremely brutal. These are people who get involved in beheading. These are people who have to recruit henchmen to protect the turf. They bring guns into the country. So narco trafficking is a sort of mother of all crimes. It involves gun running, it involves brutality, it involves money laundering, and of course it involves the actual contraband smuggling. This has a spin-off effect in that it tends to criminalize or reduce public servants, sometimes even magistrates, to policemen, to lackeys of the drug lords. So there are ever widening circles of people involved in this criminality. But because narco trafficking is so violent, we find that communities have been hit hard by violence. For example, in Guyana between 2002 or 2010, for example, we had phantom gangs. We had people driving around with modern, high-powered weapons in armored vehicles with laptop equipment, actually shooting people, shooting youngsters. Their hands were bound with duct tape. Their mouths were their eyes were blindfolded. They were shot at the back of the most horrendous crimes. There was even an allegation that a place in Georgetown was a torture chamber. So what we did not understand and what we did not measure was what I call the secondary impact of this period of criminality on families and on the relatives of the victims, that we could not expect that young children, 4 or 5 years old, maybe 15 years old, seeing their parents gunned down, seeing dead bodies on the street, hearing about daily killings, we could not expect them to be unaffected. So they've taken some of the same violence into their homes.
Okay, I was now going to come to that, because apart from the phantom gangs and the drug trade, do you believe that we've reached a stage in Guyana where we've somehow lost reasoning power? The slightest thing, people go after each other. I mean, what makes a 24-year-old brutally murder a 4-year-old? What makes a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old stab his counterpart? Have we lost reasoning power? Are we not teaching our children values anymore?
Well, that may be part of it. It's a very complex phenomenon, and I tried to explain a minute ago that some of it must be seen at the transnational and the national level. This is what has been tolerated at the national level because the police force has been weakened over the last 20 years or more, and we've had a spate of police killings. And in particular, we saw that around 2000, officers of the Guyana police force were actually being employed by people trafficking agencies as enforcers. When you get superintendents of the police force being used as enforcers, when you have juniors in the police force being used as bodyguards of drug lords, the police force lost its credibility. So instead of enforcing the law, the police force, some elements in the police force turned out to be the greatest lawbreakers. So what we had is a period in which criminals, particularly those connected with narco-trafficking and gun running, people smuggling, were actually being protected by rogue elements in the police force. So they did not fear. They did not fear being arrested, they did not fear being imprisoned and punished. So the reason why we've had this type of violence is because many of the perpetrators lost their respect for the police force, lost their respect for the criminal justice system, and felt they could do these things with impunity. And that is why there's this culture of lawlessness. I don't believe that there's anything psychologically wrong with people. Maybe some are psychopaths, I can't say. But generally, there's been so low a level of enforcement that many violent criminals thought they could get away with it. And some of the violent criminals were, in fact, connected to violent drug lords. And they were never arrested. And this is what we see happening up to the present time, because you remember, I think it might have been on his birthday or the birthday of his lawyer, Ricardo Rodriguez was gunned down, and then his bodyguard was gunned down. Then the person who was with him, who had a shot in his buttock, was, just died mysteriously. And then I think last week another person who was known to be connected with the drug lord was killed. So there is still a practice of executions, and many of the persons who actually conduct these executions are never brought to justice. So that contributes to this feeling of impunity that, okay, if I do this thing, I wouldn't be punished. So it is not always that the people are psychologically deranged. It is sometimes that, we've seen so many serious crimes committed in this country without punishment that many of the criminals say, I can get away with it. If a minister of the government, Saturday Osar, sitting cabinet minister of the government, could be assassinated along with his relatives, and no inquiry is convened, nobody is ever brought to justice by this PPP civic administration, I think the ordinary criminals say, hey, if you can kill a minister and get away with it, I can kill my girlfriend, I can kill my stepson.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the government and the minister as it relates to all of this. Question. People are now of the view that, and I must ask you this because I know you've dubbed the 2013 year for youth. People now, of course, when you read the news and you hear the stories and you look at the age of the persons involved in these things, people are of the opinion that our young people are in trouble. Aside from what you've said as it relates to finding employment for young people and finding things for them to do you believe that our young people are in trouble?
Well, society is always replenished by its youth. And young people, over the last 20 years, and that's the length of time the PPP Civic has been in government, young people over the last 20 years, even if they were just 2 or 3 years old at the time that the PPP entered in 1992, now they're coming into adolescence, now they're coming into young adulthood. And they're entering a country, they're entering a culture, they're entering a situation in which the standards have dropped, in which they themselves have very little opportunity to escape from that world of low standards and criminality, because in many instances the education has been damaged by the PPP. They have no hope. Many of our, I think about 3/4 of our students at secondary level don't matriculate. That means they don't, even if they have 1 or 2 passes at CSEC, they do not have English or mathematics, so they find it difficult to get a job. So the ranks of the unemployed is swelling, and the world that they are entering now in 2013 is far different from the world that maybe people entered in 1973 or 1983. But they have no hope. They have no hope of getting a good job. They have no hope of gainful employment. And sometimes they turn to trafficking. Sometimes they turn to other crimes. I know I've read reports quite recently in the newspapers, you would have too, that some young women are turning to prostitution simply to make a living. So the situation affecting young people in this country now, 2013, is much more dire than it was maybe even 30 years ago, because it's almost becoming hopeless. And we need to give the young people hope by rebuilding the education system, by providing more opportunities for employment, and by reducing criminality. If they felt that there were opportunities for jobs, and if they felt convinced that the life of crime would bring them to an early death, I think we can save the present generation. But right now nothing is being done for them, and too many young people are dropping out of school, too many young people don't have jobs, and too many young people are being sucked into crime as bodyguards, as enforcers for drug lords who seem to behave with impunity.
Okay. Now, Oscar Clark was beaten and robbed and shot in his home. 4-year-old brutally murdered by 24-year-old. 14-year-old student attacks another 14-year-old student with scissors to the head. And then, of course, you had the one student killing another in Okununi. I've repeated these things for a reason. Now, my question is, do you feel as though the opposition's call, of course that's along APNU along with AFC, the opposition's call for Clement Rohi's resignation is further justified?
Well, it was justified at the time of the passage of the resolution in the National Assembly in July, and it was doubly justified when he made an attempt on the 31st of December to present what he called a security reform plan. In fact, the plan focuses on public relations, it focuses on administration, it focuses on career planning, it focuses on police officers' integrity. It's a $25 million plan. I mean, what, the part that is being implemented now is $25 million. What really can be achieved in a 3,500 member police force with $25 million? What we are concerned about in Guyana on a day-to-day basis is violent crime. We're concerned with banditry. We're concerned with piracy. We're concerned with the fact that there are 3 armed robberies every day. So when you mention the attack on the PNCR General Secretary Oscar Clark, when you mention what is taking place in other parts of the country, every day there are 3 armed robberies. Now, Mr. Clement Rohi has entered his 7th year as Minister of Home Affairs, and he has not been able to bring violent crime under control. And that is what the National Assembly said last July. It did not have confidence in the ability of the Minister of Home Affairs to protect our citizens and to ensure public security. And that is why we took the action we took. It was not a personality clash. It's a competence matter. He's not competent to perform that function.
So you're still insisting, you honestly believe that with Minister Rohi removed from there, we'll see some sort of reduction in crime?
Well, I don't think it is possible to find another person who is going to be less efficient, because I think we have reached the nadir. The crime rate, the serious crime rate in this country is worse now than it was 6 years ago. And we have no drug strategy, we have no plan for suppressing criminal gangs, and these gangs are now invading schools. We find that children in schools are going there with knives, they're attacking teachers, they're attacking other boys. These are 14 and 15-year-old. For the first time in our history, we had a violent outbreak at the New Opportunity Corps. Things are out of control, and the longer Mr. Rohi remains there, the longer I'm afraid we'll all have to suffer. But there are remedies. But the plan that he pretended to introduce on the 31st December does not have those remedies. It will not deal with the narco trafficking, it will not deal with gun running, it will not deal with the armed robberies that we've been facing. Nothing in that plan indicates that there is a real resolve to deal with violent crime in this country.
Okay. Now, I'm forced to, in a sense, continue along this line, because I know there's a draft motion on interpersonal violence. And if this is taken to the National Assembly, again, we may have a problem, because the most recent sitting in the National Assembly, we saw that the Speaker of the House somewhat insisted that Minister Rohi speak and address the recent upsurge in violence. Now, my question really is if this motion goes to the National Assembly, Mr. Ramatar or the PPP has not yet indicated that the possibility exists they're going to remove Mr. Rohi from that post. It comes back to how will the ordinary people benefit, because the opposition has silenced Mr. Rohi. The PPP has made no moves to remove Mr. Rohi from that post. Where do we go from there? Because these are serious issues that affect the ordinary people of our nation.
Well, as I said, the issue of interpersonal violence I regard as what I would say a secondary impact of the violence which is taking place at the national level. It is impossible to expect children and unemployed people, young people, to see daily armed robberies, to see daily gun crimes, to see daily murders, and not be affected, not to be traumatized. And when this matter comes before the National Assembly, we are going to insist that Mr. Clement Rohi should not be allowed to speak. This is the position we had in July, and it was not a decision that is based purely on the incidents which occurred in Linden. Our decision was based on his lack of competence in protecting our citizens from violent crime. And things have gotten worse. So I expect there is going to be another collision in the National Assembly. But the opposition is quite firm and quite clear that he is not the person to look after our public security, and he should not be there. And I have seen nothing throughout his tenure to indicate that he can deal with any of the serious crimes that we're facing now.
Okay, at the risk of probably making you sound a bit redundant, sir, APNU and AFC is currently facing what I would call minor heat. The recent sitting in the National Assembly, where the Speaker did allow Mr. Rohi to address the recent upsurge in crime. Of course, the opposition walked out. People are busy. You're being accused of, playing in the sandbox. The children, the PPP walked out 2 weeks ago. Now the opposition has walked out. I'd like to give you an opportunity to make it clear, why is it that the opposition did not sit in the House for maybe 5 or 6 minutes to hear Clement Rohi speak?
Number one, Mr. Rohi's speech is useless, because we had demanded that the so-called Capita Simmons report be laid before the House, and up to now I have not met a single person in the private sector, in the National Assembly, in the trade union movement, in civil society, who has actually seen that report. Secondly, even on his own briefing, what Mr. Rohi said of that report does not indicate that there is a serious plan to tackle violent crime. It deals, as I said, with issues which are necessary in terms of improving the administration of the police force, but they are not sufficient to deal with what we're talking about. So what Mr. Roy has presented is quite useless, and when it comes before the National Assembly, we are going to demand that there is a serious plan, and we're going to demand that there is some other person than Mr. Roy to implement that plan. We do not feel that he's competent to enforce a serious plan, because over the years we are aware of the fact that certain people are benefiting from drug trafficking, they're benefiting from gun running, and nothing's been done to arrest those people. Nothing's been done to prevent those crimes from being perpetrated. And to do that, we need to go back to the fact that right now there is no national drug strategy master plan in operation. Mr. Roy has promised us the plan. He's never delivered the plan since the last one expired 2 years ago. So people need to be very careful. I don't mind being accused of taking a certain position in the National Assembly, but we're not playing. We are insisting that the National Assembly has the authority to demand that members, particularly members of the executive, particularly the Minister of Home Affairs, is accountable, and that whatever he does he must explain to the House why he has failed to do certain things. And that is why the House took that decision in July. Because of accountability, because of the authority of the House. And we are going to insist that the House does have the authority to demand that ministers of the government perform in a competent manner. And that's why we behaved as we behaved in July. And we will continue to do that. If people want to describe it as playing, well, we will insist that the type of play will ensure that this country becomes become more safe. Right now, it is very unsafe. It's unsafe for school children. It's unsafe for minors. It's unsafe for housewives. It's unsafe for fishermen. And all of this is happening under Mr. Rohi's watch. Let the people who criticize the opposition for playing games in the National Assembly explain what Mr. Rohi has done to make this country safer, to make the wives and children safer, to make school children safer. And that will explode their argument.
All right. I may be trying to put you in a position now as a social worker. I want to speak specifically to the issues, especially with the teens fighting each other in school, and of course the brutal murder of what some of us are still 4-year-old, a toddler. We know in years gone by, I may say the Barnum era, we would not have seen these things so rampant. Do you have any advice for probably parents and guardians, things that parents would have done in that time that they're probably not doing now? I'm not trying to knock parents, because I know some parents really try their best, but do you have any different advice that may help our young people to continue to be safe and go the straight and narrow road?
Well, the family is necessarily the foundation of these values, because if a child grows up in a family where there's care, where there's love, where there's adequate food and clothing and toys and so on to play with, that child is likely to be a person who reflects those values. If the child is religious, as a Muslim or a Christian or a Hindu, that child is more likely to reflect the values that he or she learns in the church or the mandir or the masjid. So we're looking at certain social institutions like the family, the church, the school, which can give the child the type of upbringing. But we must understand that children are living in a changing society. Many more mothers have to go out to work, and the child is left on his own or her own for longer periods, much earlier in life. And sometimes if the mother, for example, is a security guard, she doesn't see the child all day because the child's at school, and she's working all night, so the child doesn't see her. So the child doesn't get that advice, that guidance. And I think that is one area in which we have to pay attention to what is happening to the family. The second problem, which perhaps should be the first problem, is the problem of poverty. That some children are growing up in very, very poor households, and this government, the PPP Civic Administration, is completely misreading the situation of poverty. There are numerous cases in which children cannot afford to go to school simply because they can't afford the bus fare. They cannot afford to stay in school because they have no food. They have no breakfast, they have no lunch. And these are factors which are affecting the upbringing of the child. And sometimes the child just stays in the village, stays in the community, and hangs around with his or her buddies, and loses the value you can get in education. So many children now are losing out at home because the mother or father are not present. They're losing out at school because they can't afford to get there. And they're also losing out in society because many of the pillars of society, for example, the police force, and the magistracy, and sometimes even the governmental networks, are not functioning in their favor. In policing, we have a type of policing which does not protect. Although the motto is serve and protect, many people, particularly young wives, complain that they have gone to the police force, complaining of domestic violence, complaining of brutality, and they've gotten either late or poor response from the police. So we need to look at the problem of interpersonal violence in a holistic manner. It is not just one cause. There are several other things happening in the family, in the community, in the government system, as a whole, and we are not getting the type of caring government that we need at this particular time. We are at a crisis point in our education, we are at a crisis point in terms of society, and we are not getting the type of guidance and leadership from the government. And some of the other organs, the NGOs, things like the YMCA, YWCA that used to exist, they are no longer as strong as they were in the past. And we need to rebuild those institutions. There was a time when a youngster could look towards, becoming a member of the Pioneer Corps in the National Service, a member of the Boy Scouts Association. Many churches had youth organizations, but some of those are not functioning as well now as they used to in the past. So it's a holistic problem, and I think we need to sit down and talk about interpersonal violence, because definitely we're living in a society in which there is, I would say, a very low quality of life, a very low quality of law enforcement, very poor standards of even human dignity. I mean, children going to school, they see half-naked men or women, people who are deranged, drug addicts, and it is really having a secondary impact on them.
Okay.
It's becoming the norm. Normalness or low standards are becoming the norm.
Okay, finally, sir, in the final 2 minutes or so, the most recent sitting of the National Assembly, we also heard sentiments from the Speaker of the House about not only the young child, the toddler who was murdered, but also about the attack on PNCR General Secretary, Mr. Oscar Clark. We heard sentiments from Member of Parliament, Vanessa Kisoon. Has there been any indication, because these are serious issues that should not matter whether you're PPP or APNU, have you gotten any indication, or are there any plans to, maybe in this case, putting aside the Rohi matter, to sit with government and say, by 2014 February, we plan to have a serious reduction in crime, especially as it relates to protecting our children? Has there been any indication that you'll probably sit with government and the Alliance for Change to say we're going to address this and try to move forward from there?
Well, there's been no indication from the government, but there's certainly the will on the part of a Partnership for National Unity to sit and do this. We have already decided to do this for youth, because we feel that the crisis facing youth, particularly in employment, is a severe crisis, and we have already started doing that. We have a series of meetings with young people, interaction, engagements, symposia, conferences with young people to deal with the youth problem. And we are going to sit down with the NGOs to deal with the wider problem of interpersonal violence. We don't care if the government doesn't come, but we intend to take action on our own. The government wants to dominate everything, it wants to control. But it's been in office for 20 years, and the situation facing young people is out of control now. You know, the government sometimes thinks it can throw a few crumbs, you know, have a parade or you know, throw some money at an NGO. But there's no continuous program for the improvement of the situation affecting persons, victims of interpersonal violence. So we will do it on our own if the government doesn't want to come along.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Brigadier the Honorable David Granger, PNCR and Opposition Leader. This has been another edition of The Public Interest. Until next time, I am Malika Ramsey. Goodbye.